Now, Surrey's Mayor Brenda Locke is calling on provincial and federal governments to help tackle the ongoing extortion attacks. She's asking for 150 police officers to be temporarily deployed in Surrey. Former Surrey MLA and radio host Ginny Sims appeared on the early edition this morning. Her station, Swift 1200 AM, was the target of an extortion-related shooting about a month ago. Here's what Ginny Sims had to say about adding more police officers in Surrey.
I believe that Surrey is in dire need of more policing. Through its own poor policies of the past, Surrey is extremely short in the number of police officers it has. When you look at Vancouver, which is a city very close to ours in size, they have 1,400 and plus. We have 800 and plus. So the city historically has not kept up the number of police officers for the growth in the population and the size of the geography. But putting that aside, I think additional police officers at this time can only help in both providing protection for the victims and also for on-ground policing.
So that was former MLA Ginny Sims. And our next guest is Wade Deisman. He is a criminologist and the Associate Dean of the University Fraser Valley's Faculty of Social Sciences. Wade, hi, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
So what goes through your mind when you hear Brenda Locke advocating for 150 more police officers?
Well, I think it would be difficult to argue or quarrel with the contention that Surrey is facing a pretty critical situation right now. But as we know, there is a paucity of police officers across the province, and especially RCMP officers at this point. That's partially the reason why we created the Surrey Police Force itself. So it's not as though those police officers are just sitting on a shelf somewhere available to be deployed. And the reality is with policing anyway, that policing, if it's going to be effective, takes quite a bit of time in terms of building community trust, community collaboration, that kind of thing. So it's not just add more police officers and stir. This is, I think, not going to be a panacea by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, it may be easier said than done. I mean, if there was support for this from other levels of government, say,
Right.
where would you find 150 temporary police officers?
Right. So all the publicly available information that we have now says the RCMP is still running at about 15 to 20% below full complement staffing. So it's likely not going to come from the RCMP, perhaps other municipal forces. I don't know, to tell you the truth. But I do want to get to the point that Jenny Sims made about the need for more policing relative to Vancouver. And I think, it's tempting for all of us to think that policing is the solution. The reality is the community has a very important role. And in particular, in this context, the community has an important role to play. Many of these issues are solved by citizens stepping up and playing a role in providing information. Now, we're talking about an extortion racket that's been going on for years and years and years, only becoming public now because of people having the courage to defy some of it. And so, the more information the public can get from the community, I think the better. And in that sense, I have to say, I think, the city of Surrey has made a lot of good moves to start out with the public meetings they've held, by placing the bounty, by working to get the Bolshoi gang labeled as a terrorist group. All of those kinds of things, I think, are really important. So I think they've made some initial good moves.
Right. And what about Jenny Sims when she calls this string of extortion attacks a public safety emergency? Do you agree with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the difficulty that I get into anyway is that the question is, what does the label accomplish? We're in a polycrisis, emergency situation in a number of respects right now, where we've got a drug crisis that's creating, tremendous problems. We've got a healthcare crisis. So to a certain extent, I don't want to quarrel about the verbiage. I want to ask, what's that going to accomplish? And if that is in aid of getting more police officers, I think that's going to be a band-aid approach. I think, recognizing that things have reached a tipping point where they're no longer acceptable, I think is the language that Brenda Locke was using. And I think that is constructive language. So the question now, I think, for the community and under the leadership of the mayor is what do we need to do? And I think, in that sense, they've taken some important steps. I think there's a long history here. There's a temptation, I think, to infer that this is happening because they're transitioning to the Surrey Police Service, and that there's been a kind of, a kind of gap in terms of service. But in fact, I think a more tenable suggestion would be to say that this is due to under-policing over the last 15 to 20 years by the RCMP. I mean, and people knew about this for a long time, that they were not deep in the communities. They were not able to win community trust and support in terms of addressing these kinds of issues, where extortion was involved, where there was relationships, transnational relationships back to India, relationships with the separatist movement, all of those kinds of things. And I think that what's happened now is that those chickens have come home to roost.
Right. Well, and when you ask what would it accomplish, hiring 150 extra officers, could it accomplish some level of reassurance for the community? I mean, what do you think the impact would be on sentiments about safety overall?
Well, I would go down that road, but I just think that it's a pipe dream. There aren't 150 police officers available right now. The other 200 officers are still in the process of being onboarded by SPS, but the deficit is being made up by the RCMP right now. So the RCMP are already involved in policing this problem. So I guess if the idea is to increase from 800 to 1,000, I think that would have to be accompanied by a real vision of how they're going to build community support and trust, so that the police are getting advanced information about these issues long before they come to this kind of, boiling point on things. And the other part of this that I think is really important to talk about is there has to be a kind of crime prevention approach. Like, we're way too far downriver at this point. We need to be way farther upriver in terms of building those relationships and interdiction and all of those kinds of things, and not dealing with it just at the last moment as it comes to a crisis.
Well, it has been more than 2 years since the first investigations into these extortion attacks began. How do you think this has been handled so far?
Well, as I said, I think that they've made a few important opening maneuvers. I think, to be honest, this is the first time I've seen it spoken about so publicly, that they've had these public forums. They have made, I think, a number of arrests now. Of course, the question in those contexts is always whether they're going to be able to get a conviction. What often happens in these cases is that key witnesses decline to come forward when the rubber hits the road. So it's a bit too early to tell whether they're going to be successful in that sense, but that does send a warning shot across the bow that law enforcement intends to act. And too often it's just a kind of symbolic presence without resulting in a deeper, real sense of public safety. Like, there's the perception of public safety that's created by putting police officers on the street. And then there's the reality of public safety that's created when those police officers actually have the confidence of the communities they serve. And that results in a kind of a compact or a collaborative effort to address the root causes. And in this case, I think the root causes are complex. And so I don't want to speculate, but I know that they're there. I know that people have talked and written about some of this stuff. I think that, there needs to be more resolve on all parts to address it.
Wade, really a pleasure to hear from you, especially about this call for 150 more police officers and what that would actually accomplish. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Wayne Deisman is a criminologist, also the Associate Dean of the University Fraser Valley's Faculty of Social Sciences.